Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I am Robert Spencer, and tonight we continue in a certain way our series of interviews with noted or notorious, depending on your point of view, freedom fighters, but this time it's going to be a little bit different, if not completely different. We have with us tonight Dr. Andrew Bostom, who is, of course, the foremost scholar of Islamic anti-Semitism and the author of The Legacy of Jihad, The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, and most recently, Sharia versus Freedom. Now, the topic for our discussion tonight is interfaith dialogue and the prospects of having a genuine discussion between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And it just so happens that I have just recently completed a book that is largely about that topic, specifically from a Christian and Catholic standpoint, called Not Peace But a Sword, The Great Chasm Between Christianity and Islam. And Andrew Bostom actually offered to, instead of my interviewing him, he interviews me tonight. And so now, here's our host, Andrew Bostom.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. And to all ABN viewers, this is really a privilege for me. I've just finished reading Robert's latest work. This remarkably productive, remarkably erudite man has just completed, and I'm holding it up now for everyone if we can see this, his new book, Not Peace But a Sword, The Great Chasm Between Christianity and Islam. And I want to start right in, Robert, with what to me at least is a central question, which you address early on appropriately, and what do Muslims mean when, as per the usual therapeutic interfaith dialogue programs, they proclaim Muslims, Jews, and Christians are all children of Abraham. And therefore, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are all Abrahamic faiths.
Well, Andy, as you know, the Quran says in chapter 29, verse 46, that the Muslims should say to the people of the book that your Allah and our Allah is one, and that is that we all worship the same God. And this is a constant theme of Muslim apologetics and outreach appeals to Jews and Christians. And it is the core of this concomitant claim that we are all children of Abraham and thus have this great common ground to share. Now, this is a very canny appeal because nowadays in the West, of course, it is the prevailing view and has been for decades that if we have differences with people, that wars are not inevitable, that conflict is not inevitable, but that what we can do is sit down and talk things over and reach an understanding and find common ground, and everything will be okay. And there's been a tremendous search for this kind of common ground. The Second Vatican Council within the Catholic Church, which did many positive things, also had a tremendous focus on finding common ground, on speaking about what was similar between various religions and Catholicism, rather than even stressing or even mentioning any differences between them. And that was a particular strategy chosen at a particular time in the middle 1960s that has carried forth to this day and has morphed now into something where people think that it's somehow wrong or insulting to speak about differences, and that all we must do in order to get along is to stress our common ground and to emphasize what we have together, what we hold together to be true, and then our differences will melt away. Now, Islamic supremacist groups who practice what they call bridge building, they make very canny use of this by exploiting it in order to wring concessions out of Jewish and Christian groups and to silence their criticism of Islamic jihad and Islamic supremacism, even when it's directed against non-Muslim groups in various countries. And this is what's very odd about this. But unfortunately, when it comes to the Muslim claims that we all are children of Abraham, they have to be seen against the backdrop of the fact that the Quran in chapter 3, verse 67 says that the Jews and the Christians argue about Abraham as if they're arguing about whether he was a Jew or a Christian. And it says that they're both ignorant. Abraham was a Muslim. Now, how could Abraham have been a Muslim when he lived several thousand years before Muhammad? Well, in the Islamic view, all of the biblical prophets who were mentioned in the Quran were actually Muslims. And the original form of Judaism and the original form of Christianity, it was all Islam. The prophets taught Islam. Abraham taught Islam. Moses taught Islam. Jesus taught Islam. And then their followers came, twisted and hijacked their teachings, and created what we know of today as Judaism and Christianity. And so when Muslims say that we are all children of Abraham, they are actually making a supremacist claim that completely delegitimizes Judaism and Christianity altogether. And they are playing on the psychological weaknesses and the cultural weaknesses of their non-Muslim interlocutors, in that the non-Muslims that they're dealing with are generally anxious to find accord, to find common ground, based on the policies and the assumptions of recent decades. And they don't realize that they are playing into the hands of people whose intentions are not good. Sayyid Qutb, of the foremost Muslim Brotherhood theorist of the 20th century, he wrote that, yes, Muslims should build bridges with non-Muslims, but the bridge is one way. It is not a bridge from Islam to Jahiliyyah, the society of unbelievers, so that Muslims can become unbelievers. It is a bridge from Jahiliyyah to Islam, so that the unbelievers will become Muslims. And that's what this interfaith dialogue is generally all about from an Islamic standpoint, and the appeals from the Muslim side to our common Abrahamic faith. One final thing about Abraham is that in Genesis, of course, Abraham is identified as the father of many nations. And that is something that Christianity, early on, when it became something that was more than just a movement that included Jews, embraced and thought of itself as an embodiment thereof, because it included people from all the nations, all as children of Abraham. Now, that means that in the understanding of both Jews and Christians, Abraham is indeed a great father figure who embraces a huge variety of people. Now, the thing is that Muslims don't read Genesis, and so that when they think of us as children of Abraham, and when they say we're all children of Abraham, we have to look to the Quran to see what the Quran says Abraham was all about. In the Quran, in chapter 60, verse 4, the Quran tells us that Abraham is an excellent example, uswa hasana, the exact same words that are used for Muhammad in chapter 33, verse 21 of the Quran. But here they're qualified. It says, Abraham is an excellent example for you when he tells his father, there is enmity and hatred between you and me because you do not worship Allah, because his father was a pagan. But he is not an excellent example when he says to his father that he will pray for mercy for him. And so what the Quran is telling the Muslims there is that you should imitate Abraham when he says to even his closest blood relatives that he hates them and will hate them forever because they are not Muslims. But that you should not imitate Abraham when he says that he will pray for his non-Muslim relatives.
No, this is really critical to understanding the foundational pitfall of interfaith dialogue, and I think you also have another important examination of the fundamental differences between the God of the Quran and the God of the Judeo-Christian Bible. And one of the things that I'd like to share with your audience comes from an observation written by William Gifford Palgrave, who actually disguised as a Muslim physician journeyed through the Arabian Peninsula from 1862 to 1863, and he wrote a very important travelogue. And his description of Allah really elaborates irreconcilable differences between the Muslim conception of God and the notion of how that God is related to the Muslim conception of Sharia, which is really, it's translated as freedom, but it really means perfect slavery to Allah and the Sharia, and it highlights the differences between the biblical God, the Judeo-Christian God, and the connection to freedom. And I just want to share that with your viewers, and then have a question for you. And this is from Palgrave's description, which I think has appropriately been called a word painting. The soul power, the soul motor, movement, energy, and deed is Allah. The rest is downright inertia and mere instrumentality, from the highest archangel down to the simplest atom of creation. Hence, in this one sentence, La ilaha illa Allah, there is no God but God, is summed up a system, for want of a better name, I may be permitted to call the pantheism of force or of act, thus exclusively assigned to God, who absorbs it all, exercises it all, and to whom alone it can be ascribed, whether for preserving or for destroying, for relative evil or for equally relative good. I say relative because it is clear in such a theology, no place is left for absolute good or evil, reason or extravagance. All is abridged in the autocratical will of the one great agent. One might at first glance think that this tremendous autocrat, this uncontrolled and unsympathizing power, would be far above anything like passions, desires, or inclinations. Yet such is not the case, for he has with respect to his creatures one main feeling and source of action, namely, jealousy of them, lest they should perchance attribute to themselves something of what is his alone, and thus encroach on his all-engrossing kingdom. Hence he is ever more ready to punish them than reward, to inflict pain than to bestow pleasure, to ruin than to build. It is his singular satisfaction to make created beings continually feel that they are nothing else than his slaves, his tools, and contemptible tools also, that thus may the better acknowledge his superiority and know his power above their power, his cunning above their cunning, his will above their will, his pride above their pride, or rather, that there is no power, cunning, will, or pride save his own, but he himself sterile in his inaccessible height, neither loving nor enjoying aught save his own in self-measured decree, without son, companion, or counselor, is no less barren for himself than for his creatures. And his own barrenness and lone egoism himself is the cause and rule of his indifferent and unregarding despotism around. And in your chapter 3, the same God, of course, with a question mark, I think you elegantly summons arguments to me that justify Palgrave's word painting. Specifically, your introductory comments about linguistic identity between Islam and Christianity, and the material under the subheadings that are entitled "The Mind of the Church" about Vatican II, the rest of Catholic tradition on Islam, refrain from the Trinity, Allah is not a father, Jesus is not God's son, and neither are you. And perhaps the most intimately related discussions, Allah's automatons, getting at a lot of the crux of what Palgrave is portraying. Then they have none to defend them from God, a God of both light and darkness, and Allah is will. Could you please summarize these arguments for the viewer contained in this chapter 3?
Yeah, Andy, there's so much there, but it reminds me first off of one of the most chilling passages of the entire Quran, at least as far as I'm concerned, and that is chapter 7, verse 179, which says, "And certainly we have created for hell many of the jinn and mankind. They have hearts with which they fail to understand. They have eyes with which they fail to see. They have ears with which they fail to hear. They are like cattle, indeed even more astray. Such are utterly heedless." Right preceding that, 7:178, it says, "He whom Allah guides, he alone is rightly guided. And he whom Allah leads astray, it is they who are the losers." Now see, Allah guides you to the truth or leads you astray. In another place in the Quran it says, if he had wished, he would have guided everyone to the truth, but instead he will fill hell with jinns and men. Jinns are these spirit beings and so on. And so in reading passages like that, we think about this absolute will that Palgrave is describing, that not only is his will absolute in regard to himself, but in regard to human beings as well. Obviously, in the Jewish and Christian scheme of things, the human beings are created by God, but have free will and have responsibility for their own decisions. And that responsibility, of course, in Christian theology, plays out onto an eternal scale with the judgment and heaven and hell, and the decision ultimately having been made by the individual and by the choices that the individual made. But in Islam, Allah controls everything. He is, as Palgrave said, a lone despot. And so he is the only one who is ultimately really responsible. He could have guided everyone to the truth, but instead he will fill hell with mankind, which is an astonishing thing. He created people, in other words, a certain number of people, in order to, one may presume, the unbelievers, the most vile of created beings, also according to the Quran, and he created them in order to torture them forever in hellfire. I mean, contrast that with the book of Ezekiel, the prophet, where it says that God does not desire the death of the sinner. And that if anyone is rebellious from God or separated from God, that is the decision of the individual, but it's not something that God has chosen. But in Islam, he leads astray whom he wills. Now, what funny thing about this is that I've had some controversies with Muslims over the years where they say, oh, you're all wrong and hateful and stupid and all the things they usually say. And actually, Islam allows for free will. And it does seem contradictory because the Quran is full of these warnings of hellfire and exhortations to people to avoid it, and exhortations to people to avoid unbelief, which would seem to assume that they do have the ability to do that they have the ability to make the choice themselves and are not just Allah's automatons. However, this was a controversy that has played out in Islamic history. There was a group called the Qadariyya, and they were a party that believed that there was indeed free will and that human beings were responsible for their choices. They were opposed by clerics who believed that that was a blasphemous limitation on the all-encompassing, all-powerful, unlimited will of Allah. And consequently, they were declared heretical. And so Muslims in the United States nowadays who declare that Islam affirms the freedom of the will are actually either being deceptive, which is entirely possible, of course, as we know from many, many experiences, or they're simply ignorant of Islamic history and theology. But in Islam, Allah is considered to be absolute will. In the Judeo-Christian understanding of God, for all the differences between Judaism and Christianity in the understanding of God, Jews and Christians both believe that God is good and that God created the world and operates it according to consistent and observable laws because he is good, and goodness is one thing, truth is one thing, and he's consistent. And as you know from your book, I believe it was in The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, you have the wonderful quote from Moses Maimonides where he is expressing his tremendous frustration with the Muslim philosophers because they won't affirm anything. They won't affirm any philosophical propositions that involve any kind of affirmation that would tie down Allah to being consistent or to being good or to being anything. And so they can't even look out and say there's a mountain over there and posit something on that basis because Allah could turn the mountain into a river tomorrow if he wanted, or a horse to ride on, or whatever. And so they wouldn't even, in other words, affirm that A is A. that reality is reality, because Allah could change that at any time. And a lot of this can be traced to another passage in the Quran, one of the many infamous anti-Semitic passages in the Quran, chapter 5, verse 64, where the Quran says, the Jews say Allah's hand is chained, and may their hands be chained. The idea that his hand is chained, of course, is an idea that he's somehow limited. And to say that Allah is good or to say that Allah is anything is to somehow limit him. The things that are said of Allah, like in the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful, that begins the 113 of the Quran's 114 chapters, the compassion and mercy are hardly anywhere in evidence and are just bare affirmations that don't actually have any genuine reality at all, and certainly do not bind Allah in any sense to act in any consistent way or in any genuinely merciful or compassionate way.
And I think that this is really important to understand, not just in terms of theological differences, but the ramifications this has had for polities, for Christian states, for the Jewish state of Israel relative to Islamic states. That invariably this kind of conception of the deity is going to give rise to totalitarian states, Islamic totalitarian states. It seems to me that it's a very logical connection. Yes. Now, the next thing I wanted to do was to get to your chapter called "The Same Jesus," and I thought I would read something from the book, which I found very illuminating. It's of course our good friend Dougie, also known as Ibrahim Hooper, who's the American convert, or he would say revert, to Islam and spokesman for CARE. You cite an essay entitled "Muslims and Christians: More in Common Than You Think." He, as you put it, he begins with an evocative quotation. "Behold," the angel said, "O Mary, God giveth thee glad tidings of a word from him. His name will be Jesus Christ, the Son of Mary, held in honor in this world and the hereafter, and in the company of those nearest to God." And then he comes right to the point. Before searching for this quote in the New Testament, you might first ask your Muslim co-worker, friend, or neighbor for a copy of the Quran, Islam's revealed text. The quote is from verse 45 of chapter 3 in the Quran. Hooper then explains, "It is well known, particularly in this holiday season, that Christians follow the teachings of Jesus. What is less well understood is that Muslims love and revere Jesus as one of God's greatest messengers to mankind." He then goes on to adduce other Quranic passages about Jesus, saying that if Christians and Muslims understood all that they had in common, this mutual understanding would diffuse a great many conflicts in the world. He says, "As forces of hate in this country and worldwide try to pull Muslims and Christians apart, we are in desperate need of a unifying force that can bridge the widening gap of interfaith misunderstanding and mistrust. That force could be the message of love, peace, and forgiveness taught by Jesus and accepted by followers of both faiths." Could you please elaborate on how this again, dialogue-based introduction really obfuscates the profound differences between the Muslim conception of Jesus, or Isa, and the Christian understanding of Jesus?
Absolutely, because this is very important, because so many Christian leaders fall for this. Because, as I said at the beginning of the program, that there's so many who think if we just emphasize what we have in common and ignore our differences, then these things will go away. Our differences will go away. And Hooper's article is a prime example of that. He picks up on the things that the Quran seems to have in common with the Christian understanding of Jesus, and acts as if that's all the Quran says, as if the Quran were some sort of a text that were entirely compatible with Orthodox Christianity, when nothing could actually be further from the truth. One of the things that the Quran insists upon repeatedly is that it is not only true that Allah does not have a son, but that it's offensive, it's an insult to his transcendent majesty to say that he has a son, as if somehow it were to imply that he is incomplete or insufficient and not all supreme, all powerful, all complete within himself. So the central affirmation of Christianity, that Jesus is the Son of God, is entirely negated by that. Also, of course, the Christian understanding is that Jesus is actually God in the flesh, come to earth in order to sacrifice himself for the sins of mankind and to heal the breach between mankind and God, and thereby open the way to heaven for human beings. And in the Quran, it insists in chapter 4, verse 157, that Jesus is not actually crucified at all. And of course, if he was not crucified, he could not have risen from the dead and was not the Savior of the world. And so the central affirmations of Christianity, the things that Christianity would not even exist without, simply are flatly denied, flatly, openly denied in Islam. And what's noteworthy about the things that Hooper picks up upon and that other Islamic apologists speak about is that they are very careful in the Quran. The compilers of the Quran, rather, I should say, were very careful to erase any traces of these things. Although they were not entirely successful, they called Jesus, for example, the Word of God, which is a divine affirmation in the Gospel of John, but is hastily dismissed in the Quran as being simply an affirmation of his virgin birth. But then again, why is he born of a virgin? Why is he called the Word of God? Why is he the one returning at the end of the world when Muhammad is none of these things, and Muhammad is supposed to be a greater prophet? And so these are indications that some of the Christian material that was made over to create the Quran and the myth of Muhammad was not entirely cleansed of the Christian originals, the original Christian texts from which it was based. And this has caused discomfort for Muslims for centuries and has led some ultimately to leave Islam and to convert to Christianity, including Daniel Ali, a man I co-wrote a book with about 10 years ago, a former Muslim from Iraqi Kurdistan. But, excuse me, the bottom line here, before we have to go into a break, is that the picture of Jesus in the Quran is not only fundamentally different from the picture of Jesus in the New Testament, but also it is diametrically opposed to that picture and is an absolute challenge to and refutation of, or purported refutation of, the core affirmations and central beliefs of all the sects and various perspectives upon Christianity, all the sects of Christianity and all the various understandings of it throughout history. And so for Hooper to pretend that there's really a base, excuse me, a basis for common ground there is plainly dishonest and clearly in service of an agenda which, when we think about the fact that Hooper is with a Hamas-linked Muslim Brotherhood front group, the Council on American Islamic Relations, is frankly sinister. And on that happy note, we will take a break now for a moment. We will be back soon. This is ABN's Jihad Watch program. I am Robert Spencer, and we're here with Dr. Andrew Bostom, and we'll be right back after this. evening, and welcome back to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I'm Robert Spencer, and tonight I am not the host. The host is none other than the formidable and notorious Dr. Andrew Bostom, author of Sharia versus Freedom, The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, and The Legacy of Jihad. And we are discussing interfaith dialogue, particularly in the context of my new book, Not Peace But a Sword. Get yours now at any self-respecting bookstore. Not Peace But a Sword, The Great Chasm Between Christianity and Islam. You can see we are both holding it up. And in any case, it is available now from Catholic Answers Publishing. And get yours, get the whole set. There are now 12 Robert Spencer books. If you only own 9 or 10, then get the rest. In any case, Andy, fire away.
Well, I wanted to pick up. I think it's so crucial to the whole dialogue industry canard, which I hate to put it that way, but that's really what it's devolved into. Because it's really more. I'll like to get into this in a little question later, but Habib Malik once used the term bavardage, which is, I guess, a term from Sartre, meaning meaningless sort of discussions, because the core issues are never openly debated, disputed in a cordial way, and you do conclude the chapter, The Same Jesus, with a discussion of the traditions, particularly getting towards the end of times, and how Islam views Isa, and you also contrast the apologetic, deceitful, etc. Essay that Hooper wrote with a very frank discussion by a Saudi cleric, Abd al-Muhsin al-Qadi. And I just thought you could give us some quick comments on those two aspects of the chapter.
Well, Abd al-Muhsin al-Qadi was a bit more honest than Ibrahim Hooper. And he, of course, is a man who believes exactly the same things as Ibrahim Hooper. He's a Muslim, and so is Hooper. But Abd al-Muhsin al-Qadi is in Saudi Arabia. Ibrahim Hooper is in the United States. And so while Ibrahim Hooper, as we discussed before the break, spoke about the wonderful correspondences between Islam and Christianity, Abd al-Muhsin al-Qadi makes a tremendous broadside attack against Christianity, in which he says, today we will talk about one of the distorted religions, about a faith that deviates from the path of righteousness, about Christianity, this false faith, as about the people whom Allah described in His book as deviating from the path of righteousness. We will examine their faith, we will review their history, full of hate, abomination, and wars against Islam and Muslims. In this distorted and deformed religion, to which many of the inhabitants of the earth belong, we can see how the Christians deviate greatly from the path of righteousness by talking about the concept of the Trinity, etc., etc. Then he goes into various criticisms of Christian theology and Christian belief. And then he says, regardless of all these deviations from the path of righteousness, it is possible to see many Muslims who know about Christianity only what the Christians claim about love, tolerance, devoting life to serving the needy, and other distorted slogans. And I thought, that kind of tickled me, because, of course, the central message of Christianity is love, which doesn't mean that every Christian has been loving fully or consistently or even ever. Some Christians obviously are. That some Christians have never been. And in any case, the idea that love, the idea that tolerance is a distorted slogan, these things fly in the face of the mask that somebody like Ibrahim Hooper wears in the West. But of course, Sheikh Qadi, if he were confronted with the statements of Ibrahim Hooper, would no doubt understand that Hooper in America has to play the role of the Muslims in Mecca, in the early part of Muhammad's career, when they were weak and they were surrounded by a much larger and more powerful foe, or someone they perceived as a foe, and so they had to make nice and preach about peace, tolerance, and love. When they became stronger and moved to Medina, then the mask was off, the love was gone, the tolerance was gone, and jihad was on full throttle. Same thing for the sheikh in Saudi Arabia. He can speak honestly about Islamic belief, about Christianity and about Jesus, whereas Hooper must dissemble because the sheikh is in a place where the Muslims are not weak, and so they do not need to speak about peace and tolerance and so on. So all of this, Hooper's behavior and the sheikh's behavior, all follows established Islamic patterns that go back to the earliest traditions about Muhammad. What is unfortunate about this is how so many Western non-Muslim analysts do not realize this and fall hook, line, and sinker for the kind of nonsense that Hooper pushes.
And just very briefly, it was once explained to me by our mutual colleague and friend Mark Dury that, the quote job description for Isa would be kind of offensive, certainly in the end for Christians, because his job description includes the destruction of Christianity.
Yes, that's right. At the end of the days, Jesus, Isa, in the Muslim scheme of things, will return to the earth, just as is the understanding in Christianity, and will break all the crosses, kill the pigs, and abolish the jizya being the tax that is levied upon the people of the book, primarily Jews and Christians, in the Islamic State. And so, in other words, what he will do, he will break the cross, he will destroy the distinctive symbol of Christianity, which of course is considered to be, as the Saudi sheikh said, a false faith, a deformed religion, and he will kill the pigs, the symbol of the Christians not obeying the food laws, and he will abolish the jizya. That is, even the Christians who have submitted will no longer have that option and will convert to Islam or be killed.
Okay, there are a number of important remaining chapters, and each of them is introduced or is headed by a question, and I'll do them in order, but maybe you could sort of put them together here for the sake of time. You have a chapter 6, called "A Common Desire for Justice," and then right after that, "A Shared Sexual Ethic." And I think it would be interesting to put together some of your arguments in those two chapters, and the common misunderstandings that those chapters and their headings even represent.
Well, Andy, we go back years, and you recall that in 2007 at the Conservative Political Action Conference, I debated the famous conservative writer Dinesh D'Souza, and our debate topic was about whether Muslims and Muslims and non-Muslims should work together. It was about his book, The Enemy at Home, which blamed the American left for 9/11, based on the idea that the American left had debased the morals of American pop culture to the extent that Muslims, being conservative and moral people, were so offended by the broadcasting of American pop culture into their own countries that they lashed out with 9/11. Now, this is a howlingly absurd thesis that I still can't believe that any major publisher published, or that a writer of the stature of Dinesh D'Souza actually got behind. But nonetheless, he did. And the reality is that the jihad against the West and against non-Muslims in general has been raging for 1,400 years. It didn't start with Britney Spears. And to pretend that it did is either incredibly dishonest or incredibly ignorant. The jihad against the non-Muslims is based in the Quran on the fact that they're non-Muslims. It is not based on the fact that they're immoral non-Muslims. But in any case, what D'Souza was arguing was that conservative Americans of all creeds should ally with conservative Muslims and work together to fight for conservative values against these leftist immoral types who had caused 9/11. Now, I asked him at CPAC and at several other radio debates that we did, who were these conservative Muslims that he had in mind? And he persisted in never giving me an answer. Finally, after having been repeatedly pressed, he gave me the name of the Mufti of Egypt, Ali Goma, who is somebody who has affirmed the death penalty for apostates from Islam, has affirmed that that representational art is sinful and that representational art should be destroyed. He's hardly a conservative in the Rush Limbaugh mode. And the idea that we should make common cause with somebody like that, who clearly thinks upon both of us as filthy kuffar, is ridiculous.
And I believe he's also sanctioned wife beating, hasn't he?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, yeah. Absolutely. In accord with the Quran, chapter 4, verse 34. So it is, however, unfortunately, a still common idea, not just among people like Dinesh D'Souza, but particularly among Christian conservatives in the U.S., Catholic and evangelical, that we can make common cause with Muslims because we're all theists and we're all moral, and the secular left is immoral and atheistic. And so we ought to be able to work together with Muslims for common moral causes. Now, the problem is that this is based on entirely false assumptions, some of which I've already sketched out in regard to D'Souza. But in the first place, it completely ignores the fact that Islam allows for killing, it allows for lying, it allows for stealing, not among Muslims, but under certain circumstances by Muslims against non-Muslims. Muslims can wage jihad against infidels and kill them, and then plunder their goods and take their goods. The whole chapter of the Quran, chapter 8, Al-Anfal,
right,
that the title Al-Anfal means booty or the spoils of war, what you steal from the non-Muslims after you have killed their warriors. And you can, war is deceit, Muhammad said. So in the course of this jihad warfare, you can, with it's perfectly permissible and even meritorious to lie to the non-Muslims, to deceive them, in order to make them think that that they are friends and they have nothing to fear from you, and then, of course, they're complacent and you can kill them more easily. These are just 3 examples among very many, actually, in which it's clear that there's really no common moral ground. And when it comes to Catholic conservatives who are very concerned about abortion, contraception, right, and other life issues, they think they can make common cause with Islam, but actually Islam allows for abortion and contraception and does not have any problem with those things. And so these assumptions that we can make moral common cause against the immoral secularists are based on a series of false assumptions, many of which arise, of course, from Islamic disinformation and propaganda campaigns in the West that are based exactly on what I was referring to before, the will to render Americans complacent by making them ignorant about the true nature of Islamic doctrine and the true intentions of Islamic supremacists in the U.S.
Well, and I think so. It's sort of this horrible harmonic convergence between deception and self-deception,
yes,
which characterizes the whole dialogue industry. And again, I feel almost guilty to have to couch it in those terms, but it has become not even dialogue in an honest sense, but more more and more it's just pure dawah. It's a pure platform for Muslims to proselytize. But yeah, there was something I wanted to share with you. Actually, it was one of those rare moments of clarity. There were 2. I alluded earlier to something that Habib Malik had written, and I just want to. This was from 2003, and then it was followed up with some questions several years later by Cardinal Pell from the Archbishop from Australia. Malik was talking about his dissatisfaction with dialogue, and here's how he put it. And I would like your comments on this. And he actually referred to it as the dialogue industry. He says, well, we're all three Abrahamic religions. We're the three Middle Eastern monotheisms. The Isa of the Quran is really the same as the Jesus of the New Testament. This is politicized dialogue. This is dialogue for the sake of dialogue. Philosophically speaking, this is what Sartre called bavardage. In other words, if this is dialogue, it's pathetic. It needs to be transcended, and specifically to concentrate, to focus on the common ethical foundation for most religions can also be very misleading. Because when you get into the nitty-gritty, you find that even in what you supposed were common ethical foundations, there are vast differences, incompatibilities. Suicide bombers is one recent example. Again, this is from 2003. Condoned by major authoritative Muslim voices, completely unacceptable by Christianity. Then several years later, Cardinal Pell, who's the Archbishop of Sydney at the time, he posed 4 questions. He says, 1, do they, and he's talking about the Muslims, do they believe that the peaceful surahs of the Quran are abrogated by the verses of the sword? 2, is the program of military expansion, i.e. the jihad conquests from Arabia to Spain and India, is the program to be resumed when possible? Do they believe that democratic majorities of Muslims in Europe would impose Sharia Islamic law? 4, can we discuss Islamic history, even the hermeneutical problems around the origins of the Quran, without threats of violence? Now, I just like your comments, because it seemed to me as if the cardinal was finally, stating out the kind of things that would have to be discussed in real dialogue.
Yeah, I wish that had been followed up upon, and that really were the basis for dialogue. All too often, on the other, in contrast, we find that the Christian clerics who are engaging in this dialogue are totally clueless about Islam, and they wouldn't even know to ask those questions, or they probably would think that to ask them would be insulting or Islamophobic or something of that kind. The idea that you ask a Muslim leader about Islamic oppression of non-Muslims under Sharia, just contrast that with my dear friend Bishop Robert McManus of Worcester, who's been a frequent whipping boy on this program. And of course, I mean no disrespect to His Eminence, but the reality is that he said when he disallowed my talk at a Catholic conference in Worcester in March, he said that a discussion of the Muslim persecution of Christians in Islamic countries would jeopardize the dialogue that he was having. And I thought, now that's extraordinary. How is it that a realistic discussion of Muslim persecution of Christians should harm a discussion between Muslims and Christians? That's what they ought to be talking about. What else should they be talking about? If they're not talking about that, then what exactly is the purpose of their dialogue? I thought they were trying to iron out differences. Well, that's a difference. If they're not working to try to prevent Muslims from persecuting Christians, then what are they doing, and what's the value of it, if any?
And it's exactly the same pattern, Robert, in Muslim Jewish dialogue, in Muslim Hindu dialogue, et cetera, et cetera. It seems as if the non-Muslim interlocutors are always willing to sacrifice any effort that would get at a mea culpa-based acknowledgement and then potentially reform on the Islamic side. It's absolutely incredible. This goes on all the time. Well, I did want to get to first of all what you wanted to summarize as your conclusions from the book, and also. To me, perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of the book was this debate that you had with Peter Kreeft, and I thought it was interesting. I'll just sort of allude to it, let you finish up by discussing. where again in this debate there were a couple of interesting moments where at one point Kreeft is talking about, and I'll let you frame the whole debate, but he's talking about I was surprised to see his rather gloomy forecast about moderation. He says, "I don't personally hold much hope for a moderate and liberal Islam suddenly arising in our lifetime, but it's not intrinsically impossible. So I think we should encourage any movement in that direction." And then his final statement appears to be a complete concession to the principle to the discussion point around which the debate hinged. He says, "Well, most Muslims in the West do not believe or practice that," and I'll let you describe what he's talking about. "And I suppose Bob must be right in saying that if everything in the Quran must be accepted literally in practice, then these are bad Muslims." So in that sense, I agree with him that the best Muslim is a bad Muslim. And I just thought that this discussion that you had with him really elucidated some of the fecklessness of dialogue as it's currently constructed.
Well, you know, feckless is right. In the first place, I love Dr. Kreeft. He was my professor many, many years ago, and I was honored to have a chance to debate him, and it was nice to have a civil discussion with somebody with whom one disagrees, which is so rare in this context when Muslim spokesmen are to a man and unanimously arrogant, contemptuous, full of hatred and insults instead of being willing to have an honest discussion. But when he says that when Kreeft said at the end that if I am right, that everything in the Quran must be obeyed, well, it's not as if I made that up, and it's not as if that's not an Islamic view. This is the Quran, chapter 33, verse 36. It says, "It does not behoove a believer, male or female, that when Allah and His Messenger have decided an affair, they should exercise their choice. And whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger has strayed to manifest error." That's the Quran. The Quran is saying, if something is decided by Allah, you better do it. You don't question it. And so this has made for the fact that literalism has indeed been, throughout Islamic history, and is to this day, the dominant way to understand the Quran among Muslims. And so I was sort of surprised that he made that qualifier, because it showed that it demonstrated that he wasn't aware of that he didn't know. You know, he may have figured that there were some large Muslim group that was rather like Episcopalians or Reformed Jews or something of that kind, who generally prescind from literalism in interpreting their holy texts. But there isn't. And in any case, the debate in itself was quite interesting. I think one really noteworthy incident was when he said that he had a Muslim student at Boston College who objected to Boston College, or objected to another Catholic colleges, or maybe it was Boston College, I don't know. But anyway, they took the crucifixes off the walls. And he said, you should affirm who you are and keep them up, which is certainly true. But in any case, he said that if he believed that that were a picture of the divine being, then that would be something that he would want to have everywhere as well. And so, and he would treat it with the utmost respect. He wouldn't take it down. And so I pointed out that, well, you know, actually Muslims have, in the Balkans, recently been captured on video, going into churches and desecrating the icons, kicking them down, breaking them, and so on, and treating them with the utmost disrespect. And he said, yes, Kreeft said, he didn't say that he would treat images of Christian saints and holy people with respect. He was saying that if he thought that they were divine, if he thought that they were holy himself, then he would treat them with respect. So in other words, he had to postulate this entire imaginary situation in order to get to a place where Muslims would respect Christianity and Christian symbols. But in reality, Muslims disrespect Christian symbols out of the authentic Islamic piety that he was praising this guy for having.
So again, it's the cardinal error of imputing ideas that come from Christianity, from the Judeo-Christian West, to Islam, which has a totally different belief system.
That's it. And so this is the thing that people assume exactly that, and that's a good place to end the hour. That they assume that if something bears the name of a religion, it teaches you to be nice, to love God, to love other people, to not gossip and lie and steal and kill. And that's basically it. But in reality, there is a major world religion, and one of the three great Abrahamic faiths, that does not teach that toward those who are outside its fold, but rather teaches contempt, hatred, deception, and murder toward those people that are outside its fold. This is unpleasant, but it is nonetheless true. And any genuine dialogue and discussion can only proceed in any even remotely fruitful direction if that is acknowledged, because it's never ultimately useful or profitable to deny the truth. Andrew Bostom, thank you very much. This has been ABN's Jihad Watch program. I am Robert Spencer, and thank you very much for watching. Good night, and God bless.